Alors moi, je vais brièvement me présenter Viktor, qui va nous faire une présentation en anglais. So I will switch to English. And I will try to briefly introduce who you are, Viktor. So we are extremely happy to have you here, to welcome you in Montpellier. It's a big honor. Now you're a big shot in Europe in neuroscience. We have been knowing each other for a little while, and we met in 2002 November in South Florida. And I think it was for a satellite of Society for Neuroscience in Orlando. It was called Dynamical Neuroscience, and you had a huge poster with your postdocs, with your PhDs on brain dynamics, and I was discovering that at the time. So that was for the personal note. More formally, you studied in Manchester for your master. I don't remember where you were born, but it was yesterday. And you got a master in mathematics. And then you went on to study mathematics and philosophy. And you study with Hermann Haken for your PhD in the Institute of Theoretical Physics in Stuttgart. And Haken was your first mentor, and still he is part of your mentorship scientifically. So then your study under the umbrella of the theory developed by Haken over the years, a huge pluridisciplinary framework to study dynamical phenomena at large, I would say. He started from nonlinear optics in laser and then applied different tools across disciplines. And under his supervision, you develop your own work on modeling of cortical activity. And then you went for a postdoc in South Florida with Scott Kelso, who became your second mentor. And there you continue to study nonlinear dynamics in the brain in connection with behavior, in tight connection with behavior. And you became a professor there, and you developed your team. And from there you flew over to France, and you got appointed in Marseille, at CNRS. And there, over the years, you met your third mentor, Patrick Chauvel. And the work you will present today is deeply rooted in your tight collaboration with Patrick Chauvel, who trained, I don't know, hundreds maybe of surgeons on epileptic treatment in Cleveland, in France, in Pittsburgh, and continues over the years. And so with Patrick, you founded the Institut de Neurosciences des Systèmes à la Timone. And more recently, you were appointed as a scientific chief of the scientific committee of the EBRAINS, which is one of the follow-up of the Human Brain Project. And so today you will present the science around this work you develop around understanding and modeling epilepsy, and which had already a huge impact on the community, and provides a way, but you will present that, of course, way better than me and in depth, provides a way to classify patients on a theoretically grounded base. So thank you very much for being here, and as an illustration of a pluridisciplinary scientific endeavor at its best. Thank you, Viktor.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here. Indeed, I will give you a large tour through our activity. Can I walk around and you follow me with the camera? Okay, good. A large tour through our activities of the past 20 years on virtual brain modeling. And it is truly interdisciplinary. I loved it very much, your presentation, Andrea. I fully agree with you. Today, modern neuroscience, maybe even modern science, is really at the crossing of different disciplines, and it cannot be imagined in any other way. Yeah? What I will do, what I hear, is the sound okay? I hear an echo, yeah, okay. Yeah. I will give you a tour through our approach of how we build virtual brains, and I will use many examples in epilepsy, but I wish to emphasize that it goes way beyond epilepsy nowadays. But in epilepsy, this has become our flagship in terms of mechanism of moving forward. And with the first few slides, I'd like to show you actually what issues we can run into and what we have to interpret. Yeah? Here you see an example of drug-resistant epilepsy. So 1% of the human population is epileptic. And these patients we can typically treat pharmaceutically. Works for about 60%. For the remaining 40%, the best way of treating the patients is epilepsy surgery, so resection of the tissue. So for this, you have to know where actually to resect. And for this, we perform a pre-surgical exploration, which is invasive. So here you see the so-called stereotactic EEG. Stereotactic means that we enter into the volume. So we explore the activity in the volume. You have 10 contacts here. The needles are about that long, 2-3 millimeters, and you sample the activity inside. Then you can measure this type of activity. This here is approximately 30-60 seconds. Yeah? I'm showing this to you because I want to show you actually what type of challenges we encounter. Can you cut the video for, I'm going to the next slide. And here, what you're going to see here is actually a seizure, a patient undergoing a seizure. So the seizure has started, and what you're seeing is she rocks the upper basin. She coughs, she touches her nose, clapping. Yeah, this is all part of the seizure activity. What you see here in particular also, she has the electrodes implanted. So during this seizure, we are actually able to record the activity during this. The nurse comes in, tries to figure out how conscious she is. The seizure is over now. To what degree she is conscious and can actually interact. Yeah? So this is a standard procedure. You walk in, you try to secure the patient during the seizure. Yeah? So the patient here is implanted, and there were recordings during the seizure, and this you can continue. Yeah? This is what is represented here. You have 10 contacts, another 10 contacts, so these are the individual needles. And what I plot here is actually we call this semiology. So on the one hand side, human movement behavior that is accompanied by the activity in the brain, the spatiotemporal dynamics. And it started actually here. This is just before the onset of the seizure, which is here. You have large pre-ictal spikes, which is classic before the seizure onset. There you saw the lady, how she was sitting. And there we are actually here in the prefrontal cortex. This was a classic prefrontal temporal, maybe a parietal seizure. So based on the semiology, from the behavior, an expert can actually predict how the activity organized itself. Here, this is the seizure onset in these particular areas here. Here with some polyspikes that then start organizing itself, a little low amplitude zzz activity here, in particular also in these areas here. Do you see? Classic onset, low amplitude, very fast activity, but this was here. It's a clearly spatiotemporal behavior, and then as the human behavior evolves, actually the seizure starts organizing itself. Yeah? What you have seen, that's what I want to share with you. On the one hand side, in movement sciences, these are different movement primitives, yeah, that you can clearly functionally label. On the one hand side, they were clearly systematically organized, and they are being accompanied by this activity on the spatiotemporal level. Recognize one of the other elements we run into. These are electrode contacts that sample activity from distributed brain areas. I'm showing you the brain areas here. Never whenever anyone measures brain activity, you measure activity that is being captured by the sensors. So you have a source to sensor mapping that is highly non-trivial, and we will get back into this. So somewhere in here, the coding, the representation for this is represented. Yeah? How can we get this out? Where is the pathological part, the pathophysiological part? Where is the representation? What is the language? Yeah? In many movement paradigms, we are, or also in neuroscience, we are reducing it to language of brain states, yeah? Which implies static. There is nothing static in here. It's a clear evolution. We need a language of dynamics. What are the appropriate mathematical objects that capture this type of dynamics? Yeah? We are not talking about sequence of brain states here, even though there was a overlap, sequential temporal evolution of motor primitives that each of them had a temporal structure themselves. Yeah? So, Andrea, mathematics, neurophysiology, clinical neurology, engineering, what else do we have in there? Literally everything, yeah? If you want to do it appropriately. Yeah? And that's essentially what I'm trying to show you, what our best shot has been over the past 20 years of doing this. Yeah? And some of the challenges that we are running into here, I already alluded to them, disentangle competing mechanisms. And if you have this type of data, if you want to actually extract what the underlying cause is, and maybe also multiple causes, yeah, you're doing it on the basis of the sensor data. Yeah? But you will want to formulate it causally. It's not just a correlational descriptive approach. So you have to make a causal hypothesis and embedded it as part of your signal analysis. Today we call this causal inference. Yeah? There is no inference of a cause without a hypothesis. This is impossible. Everything else is descriptive correlational. Issue, though, with the brain and with any biological systems is the following. Multi-scale systems have, every multi-scale system, and you can show this actually mathematically, has the capacity, every nonlinear multi-scale system has the capacity or the intrinsic property that you have actually so-called degeneracies in there. Yeah? This is due to multi-scale implies hierarchies, and through the hierarchies you can actually demonstrate that the informational space is collapsed and you have degeneracies. What is a degeneracy? A degeneracy is actually the fact that the identical behavior can be generated by multiple causes. So there are multiple realizations possible leading to the same identical behavior. This is huge in terms of identifiability, especially if you want to go in a clinic. For this patient, you have to make a statement about where the epileptogenic zone is, and then you perform surgery. This is non-reversible, and you don't have a second or third shot at doing this. Yeah? So identifiability, non-identifiability plays an enormous role there in this particular context. Yves Reignac from Paris, he has called this actually the key obstacle to, the biggest challenge to progress in neurosciences. Yeah? And this is what we are dealing with. And if we want to translate this into the clinic, we have to do it for n equal 1 and in vivo. Yeah? So this is the situation. And the way how I want to walk you through this is show you our approach, how to build virtual brains. We take a digital twin approach where we are actually formalizing the totality of our knowledge in a mathematical computational form and then link it to the data analysis. I'll show you in a second how we do this and then provide you with a theoretical concept of what we are looking for. Imagine what you look for in the data set that you just saw in the patient. You have to have a hypothesis. That's the second part, and then I'll show you, depending on the time, applications in aging, our thinking in terms of schizophrenia and epilepsy. So this is a grand tour. Yeah? So Digital twin approaches you find today a lot in neuroscience or in health sciences. That was not the case 20 years ago. Yeah? But we started working with this 20 years ago, and we have a very particular digital twin approach. Yeah? That is what we are integrating is actually non-invasive brain imaging data of a single individual, and this is the one that we use to represent digitally. Yeah? A digital representation, if I ask you what a model is, we will probably get different responses. My response is the following. We have acquired 200 years knowledge in neuroscience. This knowledge can be symbolically, algorithmically, computationally, mathematically represented in a particular form. This is what I call a model. This model we can put on supercompute or resources or workstations, yeah, represented digitally, and we can insert the data to actually start getting a first, not generic, but personalized representation of a particular patient. And in addition to this, we then, when we expose it to the functional brain imaging data means temporally evolving, like the SEEG data you saw, we can actually apply machine learning approaches in order to make predictions that can be used by the clinician. Very important element there is actually the multi-scale architecture that we actually need to exploit in order to be able to identify the effects of particular manipulations, such as medication, for instance, how it scales up on the brain level. So that gets us back. So in our hands, the virtual brain is a very specific form of digital twin. Historically, it goes back to the emergence of new technologies, in particular magnetic resonance imaging, that allowed us to extract structural data. In the 90s, structural data of an individual in vivo, in particular diffusion imaging, that allowed us to actually perform this type of reconstructions of connectivity. Yeah? Today, this is referred to as the connectome, the totality of all existing connections extracted from so-called DTI data, diffusion tensor weighted imaging. When we reconstruct it, we can co-register it with anatomical MRI that allows us to reconstruct the surface, the geometry in subcortical areas. Done together in the same space, we have a network of the individual. This gives rise to the birth of a field that is called today brain connectivity, with lots of graph theory that is behind that, and the expression connectome that came actually out of our group in the first paper by Tononi, Rolf Kötter, and Olaf Sporns in 2005. The virtual brain is a simulator which is actually putting all these elements together, and then Julien, when I got to France, this is what you mentioned, in the Human Brain Project, we actually developed the tools in the HBP to actually personalize and perform all the translation into the clinic. And today this has been translated in what we refer to as EBRAINS, which is a federated European infrastructure. I will tell you a few words at the end about that. But the key is personalized medicine. And we are not dealing with individual neurons, but what we are using is actually the mathematics based on individual neurons, Hodgkin-Huxley equations for the expert, excitatory, inhibitory neurons, where we use tools from statistics, mean field theory, and nonlinear dynamics in order to obtain reduced, so information compressed representations of the activity of a population of neurons. This here is typically 2 to 12 degrees of freedom in terms of mathematical representation of the activity in a population of about 1 millimeter cube. It's referred to as a neural mass. Out of this, we can actually represent the activity in the individual regions with varying degrees of sophistication. We can put in the layered structure, etc. So this we do, and then the mathematics you end up with is something like that. In particular for the mathematicians, engineers, and physicists here. Psi dot is our activity vector. time derivative at the location x depends on a nonlinear activation, this is a node, plus nearest neighbor interactions, plus the white matter connectome I showed you earlier. Yeah? And that is communicating with other areas via long time delay, all the way up to 150 milliseconds, yeah? Along the connectome. This is the reason why the connectome plays actually a very important role. Yeah? So summarizing, a digital twin based on non-invasive brain imaging data provides us with a virtual brain. These are the steps. From the imaging data, you reconstruct in three-dimensional physical space the cortical and subcortical geometry. You parcellate so you can get a network. Then you represent each network node by a neural mass. You put in the mathematics and you connect it mathematically, yeah? Via the connectome, individualized. Yeah? We reconstruct every single fiber track in three-dimensional physical space for an individual. And then on top of this, we put in sensors. This sensor measures activity from here, here, there, and here. This was an enormous point that should not be underestimated because it bridges a gap to the clinical data. We are measuring the data here. We are not measuring the data here. Until that time, all the modeling was done on this particular level. Yeah? Or directly on the level of sensors, and then you connect the individual sensors, which is also wrong, because the interaction happens here, the measurement happens there. I'm addressing one of the your questions. Yeah? So MEG, fMRI, it can be done on different levels. So this is the approach. Now when you want to connect it to experimental data, in this loop from the real world to the digital world and back, you essentially have to make assumptions about the underlying pathophysiological course. Which means in epilepsy, you can introduce a parameterization. The parameters are always at the interface between data and the mathematical representation. So parameter inference and prediction, this is what happens on the level of parameters. And the cause, the hypothesis, you enter here. Epilepsy, hyperexcitability, multiple sclerosis. It's a time delays via signal propagation, the degeneration you have there. Yeah? So this can be mathematically represented and then estimated. Yeah? So what is it that we are estimating? When you have a data set like the one that you saw before, what do we do with that? We need a mathematical object that captures that. This is, you can perform a Fourier analysis, then you have a power spectrum, but what do you do with it? Yeah? So here I recall actually, go back to Hermann Haken, and what you have here is actually, oh sorry, voila. Yeah. An example of the synergetics in terms of the complex systems dynamics that arises whenever you have a large high-dimensional system described by nonlinear interactions with flow of information that's coming from outside, driving it out of the thermal equilibrium. In a system like this, under certain conditions, in particular when you're passing through an onset, a bifurcation, we call this bifurcation like the transition of a laser or the transition from fluid water to ice. We call this a phase transition. There, pattern formation occurs, and under this situation, you always have a low-dimensional system prescribing the dynamics that you observe here. This results in an enslaving of the other degrees of freedom. Low-dimensional means it's not high-dimensional, but the system is high-dimensional. What happens to the other degrees of freedom? They are following a particular dynamics that is imposed upon them, but not by a concert director from the outside, but it self-orchestrates. This is what synergetics is about, and Hermann Haken has developed the mathematics around that. Yeah? Disadvantage, you have to operate close to the bifurcation point. Yeah? We're not always operating close to bifurcation points. Nevertheless, we are navigating in a space that is sufficiently low-dimensional. By low-dimensional, I don't mean 10 to 8. I mean, I also do not mean 1, 2, 3, 4, but it can be 12, 15. These are the dimensionalities we encounter into the brain. Yeah? So that has been an issue. This can actually be generalized by operating close to, it should be written somewhere, close to symmetries. Yeah? Rather than, this I wish you to digest. Rather than operating close to a transition point, whenever you're operating at a symmetry, we call this equivalent dynamic system, then there is a low-dimensional space. Some of you in the classic text may have heard of the Noether theorem, yeah? Where symmetry is linked to invariances. Here we are going way beyond that and actually go into the dynamic state space, where when you have a certain symmetry, you can actually demonstrate, and I'm not going through this, but you can actually demonstrate that you have invariances in there, dynamic invariances, meaning fixed points. And when the symmetry is broken, then you have the timescale separation that generates a low-dimensional behavior in absence of any transition points or bifurcation points. You do not need to have phase transitions, as some of you, I know you're interested in that in the context of movement dynamics. So operation close to symmetries generates something like this. And this can be nicely formulated and actually generalizes the type of, we call this a manifold, a low-dimensional subspace, which is nice. And I'd like to illustrate this here in a very simple way. Imagine we have 1 and 2 dimensions, a two-dimensional system. So this is my illustration-driven high-dimensional version. Yeah? So 2 dimensions is high-dimensional, 1 dimension is low-dimensional. This is what we're talking about. If you have a dynamic system of this form, time derivative equal 0 on the right-hand side, you get some invariant subspaces in there. And if the symmetry is there, actually both invariant subspaces collapse upon each other. We call this nullkleins. If you break the symmetry where the nullkleins intersect, you have fixed points. Very important. If the space, this space, is attractive, every point here is a fixed point. Now it's not a fixed point, but by definition, this is almost 0, this is almost 0, so it's almost very slow. By definition, everything else is not slow. What comes out of this is actually you can construct flows on low-dimensional subspaces, low-dimensional, one-dimensional. Remember, one-dimensional is low-dimensional, two-dimensional is high-dimensional in this example, yeah, that allow you actually to build dynamics. Here you have a simulation of the system I just showed you, with a few more intersections, but you see the dynamics here. All the dynamics is being attracted to this low-dimensional space. And the dynamic evolves, but it evolves only on the manifold. Low-dimensional system in the neighborhood of a symmetry, no bifurcation point evolving here. Well, we can drive it with noise, and now what we are seeing is what the system does. It's sampling the manifold. We're getting closer and closer to brain data. There is a low-dimensional subspace that is driven by the noise and samples the dynamics, including the systematic predictive flows that are on it. We can do this also in higher dimensions. Julien, what is the low-dimensional manifold here? Symmetry? Approximately, yeah. It's a sphere here. Yeah, so it's a sphere with 2, I asked Radmani afterwards another question, which will be even meaner. Yeah, so 1 fixed point, another fixed point, there is a separatrix in between. This system is a 20-dimensional simulation, and the subspace is 2-dimensional here, coming out of this. This is the stuff that we can now systematically construct based on operating close to symmetries. And the symmetry in this particular case is coming from the connectivity, bless you, coming from the connectivity of the network, yeah, on the connector. So this is the situation and the concepts I wish you to have in the back of mind. Let's go back to the situation where we are analyzing this type of data. That's the last technical methodological point I wanted to share with you. We perform inference. What does it mean? It means we have a causal hypothesis that we formulate mathematically in some particular form. Then we have data, as we had it before. Again, seizure, yeah, because I have many of those, yeah, seizure data, yeah. Pre-ictal spikes, seizure onset, then zzz, small amplitude, very fast, evolves to a particular offset, spike wave complex. Same thing in frequency and time, same seizure. Pre-ictal data, seizure onset, zzz, nonlinear, so you have multiple harmonics, and then the spike wave complex to the end. What we are doing, we need to describe this somehow. Yeah? One way to do it is we can now go into the state space and unfold this time series, number one. And there are different ways of doing this. I'm not entering into the details. For the experts, time delay space is one way of doing it. The resting state is here, resting state. Onset, fast discharge. Offset of the seizure, going back. This is essentially this sequence that you see here. Yeah? If you look only at the envelope function, which I sampled here, it's essentially a projection down, and here you see the resting state, and here the fast discharge. We could have sampled also the totality of the seizure, but it turns out that this is not informative. That's the reason why we're not doing this. For this, we can actually sample this. And this is what got us into the domain of machine learning, and in particular so-called Monte Carlo approaches. A Monte Carlo approach is actually a sampling on the one hand side of the dynamics in juxtaposition of an assumed hypothesis that you're able to mathematically formulate. We can do this. And when we do this, we can actually infer parameters. Here you have an example of the parameters that represent the mathematics in there. And here you have an example from the real world scenario where we estimated one parameter, that's the epileptogenicity of a patient, which you see represented in red. So we have multiple brain areas here, and it's one parameter is a hyperexcitability, the epileptogenicity represented here, overlaid over a post-surgical MRI. This area has been actually removed surgically. Now, what I wanted to tell you is the following. There are multiple solutions available. An optimization approach is not a good approach. Yeah? And this is normal in every nonlinear system, in particular with multiple timescales. What is the square root of 4? Help me, please. Yeah? I don't hear you, sorry. Is he correct? Plus minus 2. He ignored, sorry, I'm using this now. There are two solutions. If you provide only one solution, you ignore half of all possibilities. Yeah? The full answer is plus or minus 2, and in absence of all other information, you cannot precise it anymore. Yeah? You need additional information that could potentially enter into this. We are running into this situation in the brain all the time. When we are estimating the epileptogenic zone as a hyperexcitability, we do not have one single answer, but we are estimating, we have a model that we built of the patient. We are having the SEEG data. The patient-specific data constrain the model. Yeah? And now, based on the data, the seizure data that you saw earlier, we can actually perform so-called inference, can infer in light of the model certain parameters, but we do not get unambiguous answers. Yeah? But we get so-called probability distributions, so-called posterior probability distributions. The blue is a real-world data for this particular patient, where the probability mass is here in this area where the maximum, epileptogenic, but this here, another peak, bimodal, non-epileptogenic, would be non-epileptogenic here. There we sample this with a Monte Carlo Markov chain approach. But if we take a linear approach, simple variational inference, yeah, then we are imposing a Gaussian parametric distribution and get this. Yeah? So essentially in between here. Yeah? It's extremely limiting. This is only for one brain area. If we go to multiple brain areas, theta 1, theta 2, this is the type of brain landscape we obtain. If we do an optimization approach, it tries to find a local minimum, and it gets us here, leaving us in complete ignorance of the other sampled areas. What you see here would correspond to the projection on one of these axes here. This is the real world scenario that we're dealing with. High dimensional model, data on the sensor space, model projects from the source space to the sensor space. Based on this, we have to estimate the most plausible explanation. So we're looking for evidence that we can extract from the juxtaposition of data and model. This is essentially all that is about of what we are doing. Yeah? Modeling is inference, data analysis is inference. Yeah? So this is what we are, this is essentially what we are doing when we are going into clinical applications. And the remaining time I'd like to show you some of them. Yeah? The first one is in the domain of aging, and today also schizophrenia there. This is more an advertisement of some of the activity that is happening right now. But for aging, we have actually moved further. Yeah? In aging, we run into the situation that we, especially with very aged citizens, there we are having cognitive impairment, we cannot perform lots of tasks, so very often it's a resting state that is particularly sampled. Yeah? And here you have an example of what we are finding when we are actually building a virtual brain. Yeah? And then start, this is a system, we have to scale the connectome. If G is 0, we are in a fully symmetric situation. If we don't introduce any other symmetry breaking, we have the brain areas. We are exactly in the situation that we had in the beginning in invariant space. Then we start introducing the symmetry breaking through the connectome, which is happening actually here. When I go here from the left to the right, I increase the influence of the connectome. And what you see here is what is called actually functional connectivity. And actually it's not true. It's functional connectivity dynamics. So it's a time evolution of the functional connectivity quantified over time delay. So it's the correlation of the functional connectivities that are shifted by time. Sorry, it's a little complicated. My point is the following. You see that it changes, having a maximum fluidity here. This is a time delay, shifted functional connectivities, lots of structure which is being lost here and there. If in the fully unconnected space, I'm collecting data coming from the simulations, no connection at all, what does the data cloud look like? Yeah? No symmetry breaking, fully invariant under translation. What does it look like? Translationally invariant, high dimensional, it's spherical, but it's a hypersphere depending on the dimensionality. This is essentially what you're getting. And then you start introducing the connectome, and it starts changing the geometry and the organization, and it's actually low dimensional. This is where we are here. This is referred to as fluidity. So it's a variability of the functional connectivity. Functional connectivity is covariance of the activity. And this is the area where it's most constrained, nicely constrained to these manifolds in the low dimensional subspace. And this turns out actually to be most informative. This is what it looks like, functional connectivity as it changes over time. This is real human subject. And what you see here is actually, I have reconstructed the manifold for you and how as time, this time in seconds in the fMRI, how it samples the different parts of the manifold. This is the data feature, one of the data features that we are using. It turns out to be the most informative if we want to quantify the aging brain of an individual. And it turns out when I try to do this simply more naively, structural changes and functional changes using classic connectivity approaches, they don't correlate at all. They are not informative. There is no causal hypothesis regarding connecting structural changes to functional organization. For this, you need to essentially build the corresponding virtual brain and build a appropriate hypothesis. And when you do this, and this has been done together with Svenja Kaspers in Jülich, you find actually that 1,000, this is a cohort of, it's called the 1,000 brains cohort in Jülich, over age, plotted 1,000, it's actually 700-ish individuals. When you start quantifying their structural areas, the only significant change that every one of us undergoes is a degeneration, not pathologically, but normal physiological process of aging, of interhemispheric connectivity that starts actually becoming bigger and bigger and bigger over the years, yeah, but does not correlate on the individual level with the functional changes. If we put this in a context of the virtual brain and start quantifying the fluidity, pretty much as we have done that here, we can actually formulate a hypothesis by actually estimating the changes across the hemispheres for individuals. And when we do this, we can actually compute, simulate, and compare the appropriate functional connectivity dynamics. And when we do this, we can actually reconstruct every single individual, we can virtually age them, and we can actually also separate high performers from low performers quantitatively in terms of cognitive performance. This is on the cohort level. If we do this on the individual level, we can do this actually with longitudinal data, predicting the changes of the manifold on the individual level. And this has happened here. Here, this is a predicted G change on the individual level for longitudinal data. And when you perform a clustering coming from the prediction in terms of the virtual aging process, you can actually predict the G change and then verify it in the longitudinal cohort. This is a measured G change because you can actually estimate it. This is a basis of what we call brain health trajectories. And in France, we have a large santé numérique PEPR. Yeah? That is actually a large neuroscience part is fully based on the evolution thereof, because brain health nowadays in France, in Europe, is by the WHO in 2023, it has been declared to be a priority. In absence of good therapeutic or curative approaches to dementia or other types of neurodegenerative diseases, we have to delay this process. For this, we have to be capable of predicting individual brain health trajectories. This is the reason why it's becoming a priority, yeah? On the European level. Same thing can be translated not as age as a parameter, but synaptic disconnection on a pathological level. And this is schizophrenia, or at least one of our hypotheses in schizophrenia, which has given rise to a large project applying the same identical framework in order to actually start controlling the individual medications that are coming, predicting and estimating on an individual basis how to change actually the medication for a single subject. So this is what I want to share with you with regard to aging. There we are using the sampled manifold of the resting state dynamics on a very, very high level. That is metabolism, hemodynamics. In epilepsy, we can get much closer to the individual sources, neural sources. There, the problem I've already exposed to you, based on this type of data, yeah, we have to identify the epileptogenic zone. And the stereotactic EEG, this goes actually back to Bonco and Talarac, Jean Bonco and Talarac in the 60s in Paris. Patrick Chauvel was an assistant professor, assistant doctor working with them in Paris. Then he went to Rennes and then to Marseille, where I ran into him. That was in 2011. We fell in love, academic love, and decided to create an institute based around the idea of the brain as a dynamic network. Yeah? Which is called Institut de Neurosciences des Systèmes today, and it was accepted by INSERM and founded in 2012. Key challenge here is surgery success rate. There is a plafond depending on the type of surgery. For the temporal lobe surgery, it's around 75%. Drops down all the way to, down to 25% to prefrontal epilepsies. Yeah? And this surgery success rate has not changed over the past 50 years, which means there is something that we are fundamentally missing. Yeah? And it's being always reduced to, I'm not sure if I wrote this here, to the failure. No, any surgery failure is being interpreted as the misidentification of the epileptogenic zone. Already this hypothesis we can question, whether that is true or whether there is something more fundamental. But let's stay on here. We have taken the approach that I showed you earlier, estimation of the virtual brain for a particular patient based on structural data, reconstruction. Then you get the avatar, you link it to the mathematics, and then through the machine learning approaches, you, based on the functional data, you can actually make predictions, simulate data, and go back to the patient brain. This is why it's called a digital twin. The manifold, and just to point this out here, the manifold that is actually being sampled has this particular form here of epilepsy. The geometry of epilepsy, this is a resting state. We unfold it again in a delay space. This is a resting state. What I showed you earlier, discharges. This is empirical data. Here, empirical data. This is in tuto coming directly from the mouse, the discharges. This is coming from simulation. I showed you the spiral attractor earlier. So, which means this tells you there is slow dynamics that was actually predicted by this approach. In this case, in tuto hippocampus from the rodent, it has been measured, its energy and oxygen. It can be multifactorial, it is multifactorial, but guiding you through this. This is just for your information to contextualize it a little bit. So this is a manifold that we're after for one brain region. Now it's being scaled up for multiple brain regions. Once we estimate the epileptogenic zone, we can simulate the data. We have an in silico platform that allows us actually to, on the source level, project on the sensor level, and then for an individual subject, actually show you what type of data you would measure clinically. Yeah? This is the SEEG data. Now, we do this. We go through the same inference process. We make a hypothesis about the underlying cause. This is the hyperexcitability. We go through the inference process. We personalize the virtual brain for a patient. We get his, her SEEG data. We infer the corresponding parameters. We work with the clinicians in the following way. This is a posterior probability distribution for the excitability. Red means seizure, sorry, not seizure onset. The separation between epileptogenic and non-epileptogenic. And we built a clinical report that we provide the clinician, EZ, some confidence values, and there are many other types of information that we communicate, but often we are being asked to reduce it to a minimum to be able to use in clinical practice. This is what I showed you earlier. For some retrospective data, just to show you some of the performance, this has been 54 subjects where we compare the virtual brain prediction against clinical hypothesis. So what we do is essentially we take the clinical hypothesis, overlap it with what comes from the virtual brain, and then we can perform a systematic evaluation. So for instance, here, statistical evaluation, this is a so-called precision value. 77% for seizure-free patients, drops down for seizure not free, so surgery failure. It gets much more prominent when we talk about post-surgical MRI, so we overlap actually the virtual brain prediction against the actual surgery that was performed, as I showed you earlier here. Precision, seizure-free patients, VP, virtual epileptic patient, clinical hypothesis, drops down in particular for not seizure-free, drops down enormously for the VP. This has given us confidence, plus all the work in the rodents where we tested this, that we actually got finally authorization to go into a clinical trial that started in 2019. So what we did is we built a big clinical trial with 13 reference centers all over France, where 356 patients recruited, which we virtualize. The data are centralized in Lyon, being sent to us, completely anonymized. We virtualize the patients, we build the clinical report, and we send the information back, and then it's being taken into account in the clinical decision process prospectively. Yeah? The results, we just finished patient inclusion. That was in September. In April of this year, we finished patient randomization. So the last patient will be operated this year, and then we have to wait for 1 year after surgery in order to deem the patient seizure-free or not. So we will have the results very soon, but these are the results where we stand today. Just to finish, I wanted to actually share the following with you. What is it that the added value is here? I told you that we were able to make connections to, in aging, predict individual cognitive performance. What is the additional information that we are adding here in order to do better? And it's the same as in the aging domain, but there it's informational. Here it's a little more intuitive, and I want to show this to you. Imagine the following. You're a clinician, you get a patient. Based on the semiology, on the non-invasive EEG, you make a decision. You make a first decision. You implant the patient. These are holes, it's highly invasive. Then you record the data, and then, based on the data, you make an interpretation of the SEEG data, as we have seen it before. Yeah? This is the current state of the art. We built a virtual brain, but not only of this. We built a virtual brain based on all structural data we have available, and the knowledge, connect them, and how communication occurs, how electrical activity is being communicated, not only from here, but also there is a fiber connecting there. That's the totality of our knowledge that informs us about this. So we are not only able to make a statement about what is happening here, but also here. So in principle, we have the capacity of identifying areas that were not sampled. So we're going outside of the data space. Machine learning can extract structure that is in the data. When you link it to a causal hypothesis, a model, you can also make statements of what is not in the data. You can actually go beyond that. So we can identify areas that are non-visible in here because you have not made an implantation. And this is a PC, isn't it? Yeah. So what is written here in these, sorry, changed my format. Yeah. What is written here is actually how often does that happen? Is that an exotic case? And it turns out actually that no. What I'm plotting here is a correspondence with a virtual brain prediction. When it's 100% correspondence, number of patients seizure-free, it goes up to a very large value. Yeah? When patient is not seizure-free, the peak of the correspondence between the surgery that was performed and the prediction is actually down here, so not good. And it turns out that 29% of all the cases that are here fall into this category where the epileptogenic zone is outside of the areas that were accessible. So this is the added value of the model, that you can actually unfold this space. In cognition, aging, we unfold it informationally. Here, we are unfolding it such that we get access to this type of brain areas. This is what I wanted you to have as a intuition. So, let me close. The key message was, through the addition of a model which represents our knowledge, we can actually enhance or augment the value of the data. So think beyond data. The vision would be that we can actually build twins, that we can, of individual patients, that we can virtualize, that we can operate, that we can stimulate. To go into clinic, this cannot be done in a research environment. Yeah? It cannot be done in any research environment. We don't have the right in doing this. This has to be industrialized. But at least in research environments, we can share. And this is a spirit nowadays. We share in open source environments. This is what we can actually do in EBRAINS. This is what has happened actually in EBRAINS. EBRAINS is a key outcome that came from the Human Brain Project. In 2019, it's an infrastructure that was created, yeah? And it's a federated infrastructure in Europe, yeah? That shall actually accelerate collaborative research, in which you actually take models, data, and tools, and render them interoperable, which means actually you can actually, the data can be mapped directly on models and can be directly analyzed, for instance, or inferred because they operate in the same space. So today, EBRAINS has 10 full members. These are the basic member countries, and each member country is represented by an institution. For France, for instance, it's CEA, Jülich in Germany, etc. But they represent the entire country. So there is a community. We have created nodes in individual nation, each individual nation. But there are also associate members from many European countries. For instance, Aix-Marseille University is a member, Pasteur is a member, etc. So they're not full members. The full members are representing the individual communities. Yeah? So everything that I told you in terms of models, in terms of atlasing, in terms of data, is available as a tool on the infrastructure. I invite you to go in there. It's a collaborative framework for free for the scientific community. Everyone with a scientific, academic, I should say, email address can get an account within 24 hours. There are supercompute resources that are available. 5 supercomputers are behind that. Data storage, guaranteed up to 10 years. If you want to share your data, it's a way to add value to your data by connecting it to other data and get it co-registered in the same space. Yeah? You get access to tools that are very difficult to use typically, and you can do this within this particular framework. You can map the data on parameter distributions, and essentially when you register, you can get access to data that you never ever be able to get access to. Patient data, for instance, under certain conditions. The process, of course, is more difficult, yeah? But it's all possible. We have split all the tools in the framework into 6 categories of services that allow you, for instance, fair data. These are fair data principles, how you can contribute data, how to help you to curate the data in order to make them available here. I invite you to go to ebrains.eu and actually check this out and check out the tools that are available there. Let me stop here, thank my colleagues and friends, my team at home, and actually the funders. Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thank you very much for this interesting talk. If I have time, maybe I can ask 2 questions. Okay, my first question is that the virtual brain seems quite an appropriate tool to tackle with the multi-scale complexity of biological phenomena, but rather in space. So what kind of tools this platform offer us to tackle with the multi-scale complexity, but now in time, not in space, but in time? I mean, especially in the epileptic data which you showed, I think there are dynamics which don't share the same time scales. So what kind of tools we can use on the virtual brain to tackle with this complexity?
I need to understand your question better. It's in space and time. The mathematics, it's spatial-temporal. The data are spatial-temporal. The complexity arises from the spatial complexity in terms of connectivity, from the temporal complexity in terms of nonlinearity, in terms of nonlinear propagation. So it is spatial-temporal. So I cannot agree that it's just the spatial complexity that is in there. You have the spatial and temporal complexity in both. Is there something particular you have in mind with this question?
Yes, I mean, I understand
your point. I
completely agree,
Good.
yes, of course. But what I was trying to say is that, okay, we could also consider, for example, the dynamics which appear, which evolve on faster time scales separately to focus on certain things going on in the pathological data, or vice versa, or in the similar way, but now the slow time scale and so on. So, is there a way to separate these dynamics by using the?
Yes, I understand now better. Thank you, actually, very much for this question. I focused today on the virtual brain, which is one of the 3 principles simulators in the EBRAINS infrastructure. There are 2 others. There is Neuron, there is Nest. Nest is a point neuron simulator. Neuron is a simulation ecosystem on the subcellular level. We have also smaller simulators such as Arbor or molecular simulators that are all interoperable to varying degrees of sophistication. So this is all in development, but we talk there we speak about co-simulation, in which we are actually even coupling certain simulators. I have, if you're interested, I have a lovely simulation in which we extracted the human hippocampus from surgical data, reconstructed on the neuronal level the CA1 region of the human hippocampus, where we have position of every single neuron located, and then embedded it into the virtual brain, which has been operated on this mean field level. There we get across all the scales, tempo scales. We get down on the micrometer level, yeah? We get very fast oscillations. In the virtual brain, everything is slowed down because we wanted to be close to the brain imaging data, but we are crossing the individual scales. This can be done only in an infrastructure like this one because interoperability is key. I'm not sure, don't know your background, but it's very difficult to make these simulators talk to each other because one works on the action potential level, the other one works on the local field potential level. So the multi-scale temporal structure is actually very important in there. This is the way how we are addressing, and all the data are multi-scale also.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks a lot. It was quite clear. My second question, it's a bit.
Use the chair.
But if I have the time, I don't want to. Well, you mentioned the symmetries which are linked to connectomes, and if I understood right, well, the dynamics, the geometries appearing from the dynamical evolution of certain pathologies, they depend highly on the connectome. I was wondering, okay, this connectome is something anatomical, right? If we could understand, if we could introduce symmetries regarding the functional properties of neuronal activity. Maybe this is already intrinsically encoded in the anatomical connectome, but in fact, this is my question. Is it somehow intrinsically encoded in the anatomical connectome, or should we go one step ahead, like in the future, to also introduce maybe some perturbation in this anatomical connectome, which encodes also the functional similarities of the neurons, neuronal responses, and so on? Because I think the link between functional connectivity and anatomical connectivity is lying in that part. Yeah. Thank you.
Functional information is not included in the anatomical connectome explicitly, because if you have functional information, it's always biased by where you decide to place a sensor. Yeah? So we make the separation, we use functional information and functional connectivity, but in the second step, when we are building our inference engine, in the first step, we use purely structural information because we want to span the space that is accessible to the data. However, there are a few very good points in what you're saying. There is also multi-scale. For instance, we're working with the Institut, yeah, in order to verify this. How valid is this diffusion tensor derived connectome? There are many false positives, false negatives. And there have been a decade of systematic research in order to demonstrate where does the predictive power is too little, so we don't have to invest into the complexity anymore. Where can it be enriched? How much does high resolution matter? How much does individuality of the connectome overpower the generic connectome? There is a large range of question hidden in your question, and this work exists on the animal and in the human, but it's typically based on the structural domain. The link to functional, of course, exists also, but this is being typically done either the way I have shown it, like this, or, which is my preferred way, or some people replace the anatomical connectome completely by the functional connectome. Yeah? And there are some very powerful approaches also, but all of them are limited to the data space in which you have placed the sensors. Yeah? You're welcome.
Thank you, it was fascinating. So if I understood well, you modeled the brain with the nodes, and you let the links evolve dynamically between those nodes, right? And
may I interrupt?
Yeah, sure.
So the connections are being imposed, they do not evolve, but the communication, the functional activity, as we just discussed, passes through the anatomical links, and there is an interplay, there is a connection. Sometimes under certain conditions, when we are interested in plasticity and learning, the links evolve, but that's a completely different application.
Okay, so we should understand it as a fixed graph, a quench graph. It doesn't evolve, the links do not evolve, but the flux of information changes, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So to what extent the average on a configuration? Because I guess for a given brain, you may have variation of links. Have you considered the ensemble average of connection leading to the same functions? Or, yeah.
A great question that links a little bit to my answer to this gentleman here. You can actually perform a systematic approach asking the question, how much does individual variability, for instance, matter? How sensitive are you when you go from one individual to the other? Yeah? There are many important questions hidden in this. In particular, when you have two patients, they have the same symptoms, yeah, and then you medicate them, and they react completely differently to their medication. Why do they do this? And can we actually understand this? This is what we do in the schizophrenia project, actually. This individual variability through neurodegeneracy is linked to resilience towards perturbations from the outside. This is a question you asked. So we are, this is work that has been done also human and animal over the past 10 years and is one of the hot topics of activity, because the hope is to understand better the inter-individual variability, to be able to predict why one person ages badly and another one better. That was the motivation for the aging work. And when you link it to medication, it's actually very, very important. It opens up an enormous domain, this inter-individual variability and resilience. It opens up an enormous domain relevant to mental disorders, for instance, yeah? Where we are completely lost. Yeah?
A little question, if I... It's regarding the symmetry of the symmetries of the graph. You consider symmetric links in terms of flow in information. Can you go symmetrically from A to B and from B to A? Or because I know that neurons are directional. So what is the importance of the direction of the flux? I didn't get, perhaps I didn't follow, but...
Yes. So we are impoverished with regards to the individual data that we have. The information that comes from the diffusion tensor-weighted imaging is symmetric. The links are not symmetric, but the information we obtain from the imaging is symmetric. This is already a huge error that we make. How bad is the error? So there is a eLife paper that Allen Institute and us had in, I don't remember, 2018, something like this, where we actually systematically, this we did for the animal, in the mouse, trying to estimate the connectome from a mouse, a real-world connectome, so this retrograde tracer injections that were made, so you have the real connections and the real asymmetry in there, but it comes from hundreds of different mice. Yeah? So the question is, which one is more important? Is it the individuality of the connectome, which is wrong because it's symmetric, but many false positives, but at least it's individual, or real existing fibers, but coming from hundreds of different individual mice? Which one matters most? In a summary, most important is high resolution and real existing fibers. So Allen connectome wins. Yeah? Then symmetrization, then individuality, and then generic connectome. With a generic connectome outperforms some random assumptions about the connectome. Individual connectome always outperforms generic connectome. High resolution connectomes based on real fibers always outperforms individual connectome. Yeah? And this can be quantified, has been quantified.
Thank you for this very interesting talk. I have a little question, technical question. In your integral differential equation, it's always finished with plus noise. If you apply a very brutal mean field approximation, then there is no more noise. Noise disappears. So what is the nature of that noise, and what does it mean in terms of modeling, and also if it has implication in terms of inference? Thank you.
The integral differential equations have been formulated on the mean field level. We do not derive the mean field equations plus the noise term. Yeah? So this is possible. This has not been done. This has been done in different domains. We can formulate a Fokker-Planck equation. Then we do have the fully the complete probability distribution, how it evolves over time. But on this level, we are essentially on the level of the stochastic differential equation, and we are not quantifying the noise. What we are typically adding is white Gaussian noise, linearly additive, not any what is called multiplicative terms, which would be a possibility also. Yeah? But we are driving it simply by linear Gaussian noise. If you're interested in the derivation from the microscopic to the mean field level and asking the question how the noise actually expresses itself on the mean field equation thereof, yeah? This has not been done. This was a phenomenological addition thereof. Yeah? Does that answer your question? Good.
Dr. Jirsa. How long does it take from the measurement to the diagnosis to help practically the medical staff?
In the case of epilepsy?
Epilepsy, for epilepsy.
48 hours. Once the data are in our hand, first day is a reconstruction of the data. It's automatized, but it's not, because we are talking about the diseased brain. There are atrophies in there. The data need to be checked, etc., cleaned. So the reconstruction, co-registration, and then the next step is the inference, actually. Yeah, and the inference is the bottleneck. What I have shown you in the visualizations is 100 to 250 nodes. This gives us an average brain region size of about this size, 16 square centimeters if you average across all brain regions. This is horrendous in terms of quality from source to sensor mapping. When we are working with, which we do also, we have managed to increase the resolution by a factor of 1,000. Then we are talking with 260,000 nodes. I didn't even mention it here. There we are on the millimeter resolution scale. I would not go beyond that, because then we need to go to the mixed multiscalar representations, because there the mean field approximation is not valid anymore. At least I wouldn't believe it. Yeah. On that level, the model inversion cannot be done anymore. The dimensionality is too high unless you apply tricks. So even with high performance computing, the supercompute resources we have in EBRAINS, it's there you need to do intelligently, apply some tricks in order to actually run the simulation and the inversion. And this is possible. There in the field of fluid dynamics, we have loads of examples how to do this. You can do a Galerkin projection, perform the model inversion in the Fourier space, in space and in time. You cut the upper modes and then reduce it to the first 800 leading modes. Things like this can be done. This is in development.
I do have at least another one. You don't use behavior. You don't use semiology, or your computing is not informed by what the medical staff is observing in terms of behavior in order to constrain somewhat?
Not in the processes that I showed you here, not in the clinical trial. We have the capacity of using behavior. It's Bayesian inference. When you deal with Bayesian inference, you have prior information. Something that I did not tell you is, for instance, when we go, how do we merge ex vivo and in vivo data? If I do ex vivo, then it's not coming from the patient. If I do ex vivo, it's not personalized. However, we can go to higher dimensions. Yeah? So there must be ways of doing this. And the ways of doing is through the Bayesian inference, that you take actually the best, highest dimensional representation that you have as a template, and then you bias it by introducing priors, yeah? Prior information, prior probability distribution of the parameters you wish to estimate. Then you perform your sampling, and it biases the inference process. It has been discussed by several people to do the same with semiology. The patient I showed you in the beginning, people like Patrick Chauvel, he can predict even the individual sequence of the propagation of the activity. There are other semiologies like for ictal fear, you can actually make estimations of how the activity arises. Often you perform, if the surgeon and neurologist are certain, they are just operating based on the semiology. Yeah? You can systematically introduce a semiology as a prior into the pipeline. And we have considered doing this systematically, quantitatively, by putting sensors on the face, but also on the arms. This became a little technically complicated because hospital beds are made out of metal. Then there was occlusion because typically there is a blanket, so light sensors did not work. So we looked at other technologies in order to measure the movement. This interfered then with the metal coming from the hospital beds. And then we got distracted by life, academic life, and focused on other aspects. So the ideas are there. It's probably very useful, especially in complicated cases, especially in extratemporal epilepsies, which result often in very complex epilepsies. So there is lots of work to be done, and people are very interested in doing this. Yeah. This question comes up systematically, but we need help. Yeah? Thank you.
Hi, thanks for the great talk. I had a question about blood circulation in the brain. I was wondering if the way you measure activity actually completely bypasses the problem of oxygenization, or if it may
bypasses problem of
oxygenization.
Oxygenization, yeah.
Or is it something that, well, you don't know already about, so it could potentially perturb your measurement? Well, the second question would be, can you actually use like functional imaging to do the same kind of analysis, or is it not precise enough so that you can extract brain activity from that?
Okay, what we do is we compute a forward solution, the balloon Windkessel model. Mm-hmm. Do you know it? So that's as complex as we get. We use a nonlinear version of the balloon Windkessel model. It's a neurovascular model that actually prescribes how neural activity translates into the hemodynamic response, with some details. But there we use the classic versions, such as by Buxton et al. Yeah? We do not go beyond that. We don't go beyond that. So if there are any intricacies that we should be aware of, I'm happy to learn. Yeah? But we do not take any other than, it's mostly linear filtering property. But, there are some nonlinear phenomena, like the initial dip, some phenomena that are known, that are integrated here, but in terms of, it's not consequential for the questions that we have asked so far. Yeah? And with regard to the functional connectivity question, this is something that we have been doing actually explicitly in the aging cohort. Yeah? So this is part of the summary statistics that we apply when we individualize the patients. I was emphasizing what I called fluidity, functional connectivity dynamics, mostly because it's the most promising, most informative metrics, but we are not focusing on one metrics, we use a whole summary statistics.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Questions? Well, I profit to have two questions. The first is related to Simone's question, because this is something that it appears to be a challenge for biophysics nowadays, to measure the thermodynamics of a single cell.
Thermodynamics?
Yes.
Hemodynamics or?
Thermodynamics in general.
Okay.
It's a non-equilibrium thermodynamics,
yeah.
Meaning also entropy production, yeah, and so on. And I think that may be also interesting, thinking that these cells actually are performing a physical activity, right, by sending this signal. So the thermodynamic state of the cell may be also interesting information for the whole system. The second question is more about the perspective. From your point of view, what is the next breakthrough, or what would be the next breakthrough that you would like to see in this field?
Good. The first one you formulated as a comment. What is a question that is linked to this comment?
Well, if you're thinking about the energetic of the single cell as something that maybe to use can be used in your model in the future. I mean, to say that maybe cells are some cells in the brain tissue consuming more energy than others, and then all the oxygenation and the support of nutriments can be relevant for the brain functioning, and eventually if something is related to pathologies, I don't know.
Mm-hmm. So aspects that are hot topic with regard to energy, of course, is glial cells and astrocytes. Yeah? And this we have not touched upon here explicitly. Implicitly, it is in there. If you remember the epilepsy dynamics that I have shown you, there was a slow evolution, and I didn't enter into this at all. But there, of course, there is an energy consumption behind there. There is loads of activity in terms of understanding the energy reservoir. Extracellular potassium in particular plays a very important role in terms of the glial activity there. It's a hot topic for research and better understand the multifactorial dynamics of epilepsy in particular. There is such a large repertoire of possible behaviors and different factors leading to an epileptic seizure, essentially almost everything. Once a neurologist, physiologist asked me, so he was working on animal, how to actually, if I know how he can generate a seizure. Very simply with a thumb. Just application of pressure already starts this generating pathological discharges. So it's multifactorial. This is one of the elements that we're completely missing. That requires, that's fundamental neuroscience. I'm not sure to what degree it will help the clinical translation at some point. There is a huge need of elaborating the glial and astrocytic aspect thereof. It's ongoing, yeah? Not in our lab, but many of our colleagues are working on this. They are very interested they're interested to integrate it into the platform because of the importance thereof, or the promise of importance. So that addresses to some degree your second question. From my personal perspective, I'd like to see stimulation, perturbation, to be much stronger developed, because I spoke about resting state, I spoke about spontaneous seizures. In order, when we are dealing with patients, very often it is limited to resting state dynamics or spontaneous dynamics. Other paradigms, such as cognitive task paradigms, are often very badly controlled, or the patients are incapable of performing them. So we need, but we are running into situations of non-identifiability. When we want to identify the cause of a particular disease, it turns out to be non-identifiable. Yeah? In seizures, we can see the seizures, and we know what the challenges are, even though the causes are so widely varied. Yeah? But in other diseases, we don't see the data features, yeah? So we have to infer them differently. Stimulation, perturbation can add, because this we can control. It has to be non-invasive if possible, and there is loads of technological development. Invasive stimulation has already shown loads of progress and proof of concept that it enhances the identifiability. For standard diagnostic purposes, this is not the preferred way of doing it. For some patients we have to, yeah, Parkinson for instance, but in general we cannot. So I think this is one of the most promising approaches on the macroscopic level that I've been speaking about. When we go on the microscopic multi-scale level, there all these aspects that we addressed earlier in these discussions are playing a major role.
Question? Oh, yeah, sorry. Yeah. Last one.
Yes, I will not abuse. Okay.
The first one.
Once you mentioned the stimulation, now I was thinking, what about? Okay, if I to my knowledge, the virtual brain is at the level of the brain, right? It's not connected to other peripheries, sensorial peripheries like the retina and so on. Is there some ideas, some plans pertinent to such things, such combinations with certain sensorial peripheries, or is it open to that?
So it is open to this in EBRAINS, we have a large component that is linked, dedicated to neurorobotics. It's in development. Clinical translation has been a priority for historical reasons. Also because we were pushed by the European Commission, essentially, to prioritize this. However, technical applications, in particular neurorobotics, plays a major role. There are some groups from Munich in particular and from Pavia, Italy. So Munich, Germany, Pavia, Italy, to be politically correct. They make some major contributions to, there are approaches of taking this type of connectome-based approach, building cognitive architectures to control robots operating in virtual domains. Yeah, Egidio D'Angelo, for instance, has done some work there. So this exists. It is in development in EBRAINS. The neurorobotics platform exists. There are multiple things that are missing, like you need a world simulator that you can actually integrate in this. So there are some specifications that exist. What I like is the use of certain cognitive architectures for navigational control. That's Michele Mignore. Thank you, I was blanking on his last name. That has done some proof of concept studies there. So there is work in place. It's not as developed as the clinical. Yeah, but you ask the question, is there space? Yes. If you want to contribute, please contribute. Yeah, it's an open infrastructure. Contribute and help developing. There are curation processes in place. If you have to contribute, we'll help with the curation, with the integration, and you have a lot to gain, hopefully, but the platform will gain, so everyone else will gain. Yeah, that is the idea.
Thank you.
Yeah. You're welcome.